The millionaire married a full woman for the sake of argument, but what he learned shook him to his core. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories. Tell us in the comments what city you're from. Jasper Carter sat in his grand penthouse high above the city lights of Manhattan with a crystal glass of whiskey in hand. The world below seemed small, insignificant, a reflection of how he viewed most people. At 43, Jasper was a self-made billionaire, the CEO of Carter Enterprises, the epitome of success in the world of high finance. He had everything a man could desire: wealth, power, and influence. Yet beneath his tailored suits and polished image lay an unshakable arrogance built on years of unchallenged dominance. Jasper's social circle was a mirror of his personality: elitist, self-congratulatory, and deeply insulated from the realities of everyday life. Tonight, he was hosting one of his infamous cocktail parties where the city's most powerful and affluent mingled. Expensive champagne flowed like water, laughter echoed across the luxurious space, and conversations revolved around investment deals, extravagant vacations, and the occasional mockery of those outside their exclusive world. As Jasper moved effortlessly through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries and basking in admiration, his longtime friend and occasional rival, Hugo Whitman, cornered him by the marble bar. "Still the same Jasper," Hugo said, smirking as he swirled the wine in his glass. "Always a man with the perfect life." Jasper raised an eyebrow. "Would you expect anything less?" Hugo chuckled. "Not at all. But tell me, do you ever get tired of it? The same parties, the same people, the same, well, everything?" Jasper took a sip of his whiskey and leaned against the bar. "Tired? Hardly. Why change something that works?" Hugo's smirk grew wider, a glint of mischief in his eyes. "You're too predictable, Jasper. You've built an empire, sure, but you've also built walls so high that no one can surprise you anymore. Don't you ever crave a challenge?" Jasper tilted his head, intrigued but wary. "What kind of challenge?" Hugo leaned closer, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "A real challenge. Something outside your world of control. Something or someone you can't buy, manipulate, or dominate." Jasper laughed, the sound sharp and confident. "There's no such thing." "Oh, I think there is," Hugo said, straightening. "In fact, I'll bet you on it." The word bet caught Jasper's attention like a hook. He was competitive to a fault, and Hugo knew it. Jasper's life was a series of calculated victories, each one reinforcing his belief that he could conquer any obstacle. "What's the bet?" Jasper asked, his tone casual but his interest piqued. Hugo gestured toward the room, where guests mingled in their designer outfits, sipping vintage wine. "We both know you have a type, Jasper. Young, beautiful, refined women who fit perfectly into this world of yours. But what if I told you to marry someone who's the complete opposite?" Jasper raised an eyebrow. "Define opposite." Hugo's smirk turned into a grin. "Someone who doesn't fit your mold. Someone who's not conventionally beautiful by your standards, who comes from a completely different world. And here's the catch. You'd have to stay married for 6 months. No tricks, no loopholes." Jasper set his glass down, his mind already racing. He saw the challenge for what it was: a game, an opportunity to prove his superiority. The terms were absurd, but that only made the prospect more enticing. "And what's in it for me?" Jasper asked. Hugo leaned in, lowering his voice. "If you succeed, I'll personally invest $50 million into Carter Enterprises, no strings attached. But if you fail, well, let's just say your reputation as the man who always wins will take a serious hit." Jasper smirked, his confidence unshaken. "You're on." The conversation shifted, but the bet lingered in Jasper's mind. He prided himself on his ability to win any game, and this one, though unconventional, would be no different. He would find someone, marry her, and prove that no matter the circumstances, Jasper Carter always came out on top. Over the next week, Jasper set his team into motion. His personal assistant, Abigail, discreetly compiled a list of potential candidates, women who were far removed from Jasper's world, yet fit the criteria Hugo had laid out. Jasper scanned the profiles with a detached curiosity, each name and face feeling like another deal to be negotiated. Then he saw her, Isabella James. She stood out immediately, not because she fit his ideal, but because she defied it in every way. A 36-year-old black woman with a full, curvaceous figure, Isabella was a social worker who ran a non-profit organization dedicated to helping underserved communities. She had no ties to high society, no interest in luxury, and a fiery reputation for standing her ground. Jasper smirked. She would do. He arranged a meeting under the guise of discussing a potential partnership with her nonprofit. When Isabella walked into his office, Jasper was struck by her presence. She carried herself with a quiet confidence, her natural curls framing a face that was warm yet unyielding. She was dressed simply but professionally, a stark contrast to the polished perfection of the women Jasper was used to. "Mr. Carter," she said, extending a hand, "thank you for reaching out. I wasn't expecting a man of your stature to take an interest in our work." Her words, though polite, carried a subtle challenge. Jasper smiled, masking his own intrigue. "Miss James, I believe in supporting meaningful causes. Your work caught my attention." The meeting proceeded with Isabella explaining her nonprofit's mission and the struggles they faced in securing funding. Jasper listened, feigning interest while mentally calculating how best to present his proposition. When the conversation shifted, Jasper leaned forward, his tone shifting to one of quiet authority. "Isabella, I have a proposal for you, one that could provide your organization with the resources it desperately needs." Her eyes narrowed slightly, her skepticism evident. "What kind of proposal?" Jasper smiled. "Marry me." The room fell silent. Jasper explained the terms carefully, omitting the true nature of the bet. He framed the marriage as a mutually beneficial arrangement. She would gain the funding and visibility her nonprofit needed, and he claimed it would help improve his public image. Isabella's expression remained unreadable as she listened. Jasper knew she was weighing her options. She was intelligent and cautious, qualities he found both frustrating and intriguing. "I'll need time to think about it," she finally said. Jasper nodded, though he knew he had already planted the seed. People always came around when the stakes were high enough. As Isabella left his office, Jasper felt a surge of satisfaction. The pieces were falling into place, and soon the game would begin. Little did he know the challenge he had so confidently embraced would unravel his carefully constructed world in ways he could never have anticipated. Isabella James sat at the small wooden desk in her modest office, surrounded by piles of papers, budget sheets, and community grant applications. The fluorescent lights flickered above her as she reviewed yet another rejection letter from a potential donor. Frustration gnawed at her, but she refused to let it consume her. For the past 10 years, she had poured her heart and soul into her nonprofit organization, Rise Up, which provided housing, education, and career opportunities for underserved communities. Despite the challenges, she believed in her work, even when funding was scarce. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. The message was from Jasper Carter's assistant, Abigail, confirming a follow-up meeting. Isabella stared at the screen, her brow furrowing. The first meeting with Jasper had been unexpected. Billionaires like him rarely showed interest in grassroots organizations like hers. He was polished, self-assured, and truth be told, intimidating. Yet there had been something in his proposal, a mix of audacity and intrigue that lingered in her mind. When Isabella arrived at Jasper's sleek corporate office the next day, she felt out of place. The building's towering glass walls and cold, pristine interior were a stark contrast to the vibrant yet humble community center where she spent most of her days. Still, she walked in with her head held high, determined not to let her surroundings diminish her confidence. Jasper greeted her with the same polished charm he had shown during their first meeting. He gestured for her to sit in one of the plush leather chairs in front of his desk, his expression unreadable. "Miss James," he began, his voice smooth, "thank you for coming back. I take it you've had time to consider my proposal?" Isabella crossed her arms, her gaze steady. "I've thought about it, but I still don't understand why a man like you would suggest something so unconventional. A marriage proposal isn't exactly what I expected when you said you wanted to help." Jasper leaned back, his hands clasped in front of him. "Let's be honest, Isabella. People like me, people with wealth and influence, are often scrutinized. Partnerships like this can benefit both parties. You need funding for your organization, and I need to show that I'm committed to causes that matter." Isabella tilted her head. "So you're looking for a public relations move?" "Not just that," Jasper said, a hint of amusement in his tone. "I believe in mutually beneficial arrangements. This is business, Miss James, nothing more." The word business settled heavily between them. For Isabella, Her work was deeply personal, tied to her identity and the struggles she had faced growing up. For Jasper, it seemed everything was transactional, a game of leverage and control. Yet she couldn't deny that his resources could transform her nonprofit. The idea of a sham marriage left a bitter taste in her mouth, but she knew what was at stake for the people she served. After a long silence, she spoke. "If I agree to this, I have conditions. My independence isn't negotiable. I'll continue my work as I see fit, without interference from you, and every cent you provide goes directly to the community." Jasper's smile widened, a glint of triumph in his eyes. "Agreed, and one more thing," Isabella added, leaning forward. "If I feel at any point that this arrangement compromises my values, I'll walk away. No amount of money will keep me here." Jasper's confidence didn't waver. "Understood." With a reluctant nod, Isabella extended her hand. Jasper shook it firmly, sealing the deal. As she left his office, a mixture of doubt and resolve swirled within her. She had made a decision that could change the lives of those she worked so hard to support, but it came at a personal cost. The wedding was arranged swiftly, with minimal fanfare. Jasper ensured that the ceremony, though small, exuded elegance. Isabella arrived in a simple ivory dress, refusing the stylist and designer that Jasper's assistant had insisted upon. She felt like a stranger in the pristine chapel, surrounded by Jasper's polished acquaintances and a few distant relatives. The absence of her own friends and family was deliberate. She couldn't bear to explain the situation to them. As the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Isabella caught Jasper's expression. He looked pleased, as though he had just closed a lucrative deal. Her stomach churned at the thought. The reception was equally impersonal. Jasper mingled with his guests, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries, while Isabella sat quietly at a cornered table, observing the spectacle. She felt like a prop, a piece in Jasper's elaborate chess game. Despite her discomfort, she reminded herself why she had agreed to this: the funding for Rise Up. She couldn't let her pride stand in the way of helping those who depended on her. Their first night as a married couple set the tone for their arrangement. Jasper escorted Isabella to the penthouse, a sprawling space filled with modern art, gleaming surfaces, and floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the Manhattan skyline. It was a far cry from the cozy apartment she called home. "This is your home now," Jasper said, his tone formal. "I trust you'll find it comfortable." Isabella's eyes swept across the space, her expression neutral. "It's impressive," Jasper smirked. "You'll get used to it." Isabella, however, had no intention of getting used to anything. She unpacked her belongings in the guest room, a clear signal to Jasper that she had no plans to share more than the title of wife. He raised an eyebrow but said nothing, retreating to his own room without further comment. In the weeks that followed, their dynamic took shape. Jasper, true to his word, transferred substantial funds to Rise Up, which allowed Isabella to expand her programs and hire additional staff. Yet despite the material benefits, tension simmered between them. Jasper, accustomed to being the center of attention, found Isabella's indifference both puzzling and infuriating. She refused his invitations to attend high society events, choosing instead to focus on her work. Isabella, for her part, maintained her boundaries with unwavering determination. She saw through Jasper's attempts to impress her with lavish gifts and extravagant gestures. When he presented her with a diamond necklace, she politely declined, stating, "I'd rather see that money go toward building a new community center." Jasper's frustration grew, but he masked it with his usual air of confidence. He believed he could outlast her resolve, that eventually she would fall in line with his world. What he didn't realize was that Isabella wasn't playing by his rules. Her strength, her unwavering sense of self, was a challenge he hadn't anticipated. As the days turned into weeks, the cracks in Jasper's carefully constructed facade began to show. For the first time in his life, he was facing someone he couldn't control, and it both intrigued and unsettled him. What had started as a game was beginning to feel far more complicated than he had bargained for. The glossy black car rolled into the heart of the city's most neglected neighborhood. Jasper Carter sat in the back seat, glancing out the tinted window at the crumbling buildings, the faded graffiti scrawled on brick walls, and the uneven sidewalks filled with children playing, people chatting, and the occasional hollow-eyed man leaning against a lamppost. The scenes were foreign to him, almost surreal, like a scene from a documentary he would have turned off after a few minutes. Isabella had insisted, that Jasper accompany her to one of Rise Up's community events. For her, this was a chance to showcase the work that meant everything to her. For Jasper, it was an obligation, another box to tick off to maintain the facade of their arrangement. The car stopped in front of a converted warehouse. The once derelict building now served as a bustling community center, its bright mural-covered walls standing out against the gray monotony of the surrounding neighborhood. Isabella was already there, dressed in jeans and a navy Rise Up t-shirt, directing volunteers with calm efficiency. She moved with purpose, pausing to greet families, comfort children, and organize donations. Her energy was magnetic, and despite his reservations, Jasper found himself watching her with a mix of curiosity and unease. Stepping out of the car, Jasper was immediately struck by how out of place he felt. His tailored suit and Italian leather shoes might as well have been a neon sign proclaiming, "I don't belong here." Heads turned as he approached, some with curiosity, others with open disdain. The unease in his chest grew, but he straightened his shoulders, determined not to let it show. Isabella greeted him with a brisk nod. "Glad you could make it," she said, her tone professional but distant. "Let's start with the food pantry." She led him inside where rows of tables were stacked with donated goods, canned food, fresh produce, and bags of rice. Volunteers moved efficiently, handing out supplies to families, many of whom looked tired and worn but grateful. Isabella explained the process as they walked, her voice steady and matter-of-fact. "This is one of our main programs," she said. "We provide food to over 200 families every week. Most of them are dealing with unemployment, low wages, or medical debt. Without this, some of them wouldn't eat." Jasper nodded politely, though he couldn't help but think about the millions of dollars that flowed through his company daily. To him, 200 families seemed like a small number. He almost said as much but caught himself, realizing how tone-deaf it would sound in this context. They moved on to the after-school tutoring area, where children sat at small tables with volunteer teachers. The walls were decorated with colorful posters and drawings, a stark contrast to the harsh reality outside. Isabella knelt beside one of the tables, talking to a young boy who was struggling with a math worksheet. Jasper watched from a distance, feeling like an intruder in a world he didn't understand. "Why do you do this?" he asked when Isabella rejoined him. "I mean, you've clearly poured your life into this work, but why?" She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Because someone has to," she said simply. "Because I know what it's like to feel invisible, to struggle and wonder if anyone cares. And because I can't stand the thought of doing nothing when I know I can help." Jasper didn't respond. Her words unsettled him, not because he disagreed, but because they forced him to confront a truth he had spent his life avoiding. He had never cared about anyone outside his carefully curated circle. His world was built on profit margins and power plays, and the idea of dedicating himself to something selfless was as foreign to him as this neighborhood. The day continued with Isabella, leading Jasper through every corner of the center. He met single mothers trying to rebuild their lives, teenagers hoping for a better future, and elderly residents grateful for a place to feel safe. Each interaction chipped away at his confidence, leaving him with a growing sense of discomfort. He was used to being the most powerful person in the room, the one everyone deferred to. But here, his wealth and status meant nothing. By the time they returned to the car, Jasper was uncharacteristically quiet. Isabella didn't press him for his thoughts, and the silence between them was heavy. As the car pulled away, Jasper stared out the window, his mind racing. For the first time in years, he felt uncertain about himself, about his decisions, and about the world beyond his ivory tower. That evening, back in the penthouse, Jasper poured himself a drink and sat by the floor to ceiling windows overlooking the glittering city skyline. Normally, the view filled him with a sense of pride and accomplishment. Tonight, it felt hollow. The faces he had seen that day, the tired mother balancing a toddler on her hip, the elderly man whose hands trembled as he accepted a food box, the teenage girl who said she wanted to be a doctor, lingered in his mind. They were people he would have dismissed without a second thought just weeks ago. Now he couldn't shake the feeling that he had missed something important, something real. Isabella arrived home an hour later, carrying a box of leftover donations. She didn't acknowledge Jasper as she walked past him into the kitchen, unloading the contents onto the counter. He watched her from the living room, unsure of what to say. Finally, he set his glass down and spoke. Today was different. Isabella glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. "Is that your way of saying uncomfortable?" Jasper hesitated. "Maybe." It's not the kind of environment I'm used to." "That's obvious," she said, her tone cutting but not unkind. "But maybe that's the problem. You've built your entire life in a bubble, Jasper. You don't know what it's like to struggle, to worry about things like rent or feeding your family." Her words stung, though Jasper couldn't deny their truth. He wanted to argue, to remind her of his success and the sacrifices he had made to achieve it. But something stopped him. Instead, he nodded, surprising himself. "You're right," he said quietly. "I don't understand, but I'd like to." Isabella looked at him for a long moment, her expression softening ever so slightly. "We'll see," she said, turning back to her task. "Actions speak louder than words." Jasper stayed silent, her words echoing in his mind. He had always prided himself on his ability to win, to conquer any challenge. But this wasn't a game, and for the first time, he wasn't sure if winning was even the goal. As the night wore on, Jasper found himself thinking less about the bet and more about the woman who had unintentionally turned his world upside down. Isabella was unlike anyone he had ever met. Strong, unyielding, and deeply compassionate. She challenged him in ways he didn't know he needed, and though he wouldn't admit it, he found himself wanting to rise to that challenge. For the first time in his life, Jasper Carter wasn't sure who he was, and the uncertainty terrified him. Jasper Carter had always believed that control was his greatest strength. Every move he made, every decision was calculated to ensure he maintained power over his life and the people in it. Yet Isabella James seemed immune to his influence, and her unwavering independence was beginning to test his patience. The events at the community center had left him unsettled, and instead of reflecting on his discomfort, he did what he always did when faced with uncertainty. He sought to assert control. The morning after their visit to Rise Up, Jasper walked into the kitchen, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, his confidence seemingly restored. Isabella was already there, sipping her coffee and reading a report on her laptop. She didn't look up when he entered, her focus entirely on her work. "You know," Jasper began, pouring himself a cup of coffee, "if you spent less time buried in those papers and more time at events with me, you might actually enjoy yourself." Isabella's gaze flicked up briefly, her expression neutral. "Enjoy myself at one of your society galas where people pretend to care about causes they don't understand? No thank you." Jasper's jaw tightened. "Those galas raise millions of dollars. They're effective. For the organizers, maybe," Isabella replied, setting her mug down. "But they rarely make a difference for the people who actually need help. Real change doesn't come from fancy dinners and empty speeches." Her words struck a nerve. Jasper had built his empire on the belief that appearances mattered more than substance. He prided himself on his ability to charm and influence. Yet here was someone who saw through it all. Instead of engaging further, he changed tactics. "I have a charity event tonight," he said, keeping his tone light. "It would mean a lot if you joined me." Isabella's expression didn't soften. "And by mean a lot, you mean it would look good for your image?" Jasper smirked, though the comment stung. "Call it what you want. It's still a good opportunity for you to network." "I'm not interested in networking with people who don't understand what I do," Isabella said firmly. "But thank you for the offer." Her refusal left Jasper simmering with frustration. He had assumed that his wealth and influence would eventually win her over, but Isabella was proving to be a far greater challenge than he had anticipated. That evening, Jasper attended the gala alone. The event was held in a glittering ballroom filled with Manhattan's elite, all dressed to impress. Conversations revolved around investment opportunities, art auctions, and charitable donations that doubled as tax write-offs. Jasper moved through the room effortlessly, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about Isabella, her sharp words, her quiet strength, the way she had dismissed everything he valued. For the first time in years, he felt an unfamiliar pang of self-doubt. Was she right? Were all his efforts at philanthropy little more than performative gestures? The thought unsettled him, and he drowned it in another glass of champagne. The next day, Jasper decided to take a more aggressive approach. If Isabella refused to adapt to his world, he would find a way to impose it on her. He began scheduling events and meetings that required her presence, framing them as essential for the visibility of Rise Up. Isabella reluctantly attended a few, but quickly grew weary of the superficiality. At one such event, a luncheon hosted by one of Jasper's business partners, Isabella found herself seated between two women who seemed more interested in gossip than meaningful conversation. One of them leaned closer, her diamond earrings catching the light. "So, Isabella," she said with a syrupy smile, "how did you and Jasper meet? It must have been quite the whirlwind romance." Isabella forced a polite smile. "We met through mutual connections." "Ah, of course," the woman replied, clearly fishing for more. "And your work? What is it you do again?" "I run a nonprofit organization," Isabella said, her tone calm but firm. "We focus on providing resources and support for underserved communities." The woman's smile faltered, and her interest waned almost immediately. "How noble," she said dismissively, turning her attention to the woman on her other side. Isabella bit back a retort, her frustration simmering. She glanced at Jasper, who was deep in conversation with another guest, seemingly oblivious to her discomfort. Later, as they rode home in silence, Isabella finally spoke. "This isn't working." Jasper looked at her, his expression unreadable. "What isn't?" "This," she said, gesturing between them. "You dragging me to events where no one cares about what I do or who I am. It's a waste of time for both of us." Jasper frowned. "Those events are opportunities to build connections. You could secure funding for your programs if you played your cards right." Isabella shook her head. "You still don't get it, do you? I'm not interested in playing games or pandering to people who only care about their image. My work is about real people, real issues, not impressing your friends." Her words cut through Jasper's defenses, but instead of acknowledging her point, he doubled down. "Sometimes you have to compromise, Isabella. That's how the world works." "Maybe in your world," she shot back, "but I'm not like you, Jasper. I don't compromise my values for convenience." The car fell silent again, the tension between them thick and unyielding. Over the next few weeks, their conflicts escalated. Jasper's attempts to control Isabella became more overt, and her resistance only grew stronger. He began questioning her decisions, subtly undermining her authority at Rise Up by suggesting alternative uses for the funds he provided. Isabella pushed back, refusing to let him dictate her work. One evening, their argument reached a boiling point. "You think you're so righteous," Jasper snapped. "But the truth is, without my money, your precious nonprofit wouldn't survive." Isabella's eyes narrowed, her voice low and steady. "You're right, your money has helped, but don't think for a second that it gives you the right to control me or what I do. I've built this organization from the ground up without your help, and I'll keep fighting for it with or without you." Her words hit Jasper harder than he expected. For a moment, he saw her not as a challenge to conquer, but as someone who had endured far more than he ever had. The realization was uncomfortable, and he didn't know how to respond. Instead, he turned away, retreating to his study. As he poured himself another drink, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he was losing not just the bet, but something far more significant. For the first time in his life, Jasper Carter was facing a battle he wasn't sure he could win. The days following their explosive argument were marked by a tense silence. Isabella focused entirely on her work at Rise Up, avoiding Jasper whenever possible. She spent long hours at the community center, pouring her frustration into helping others. Jasper, meanwhile, retreated to his office, burying himself in business deals and financial reports. Both were too stubborn to address the growing divide between them, but the tension was palpable. Jasper couldn't stop replaying Isabella's words in his head. "I've built this organization from the ground up without your help, and I'll keep fighting for it with or without you." Her defiance, her refusal to be intimidated by him was infuriating, and yet it stirred something deeper within him. For years, he had surrounded himself with people who bent to his will, but Isabella was unyielding, and that made her impossible to ignore. One evening, Jasper found himself scrolling through Rise Up's social media page. He had never taken a real interest in the organization before, but now curiosity drove him to learn more. He watched videos of Isabella speaking at events, her voice passionate and unwavering as she advocated for the people she served. He read testimonials from individuals whose lives had been transformed by her work. A single mother who had found stable housing, a young man who had earned a scholarship thanks to the center's tutoring program, an elderly woman who no longer felt invisible. The stories were humbling, and Jasper couldn't shake the sense of inadequacy they awakened in him. For the first time, he began to question the value of his own achievements. His billions had bought him power and prestige, but what had he really done to make a difference? The next morning, Jasper made a decision. Instead of waiting for Isabella to return to the penthouse late in the evening, he decided to meet her on her turf. He arrived at the community center unannounced, stepping into the bustling building with its peeling paint and mismatched furniture. The air buzzed with energy as volunteers sorted donations. Children played in the corner, and a group of seniors discussed their plans for a community garden. Jasper felt out of place, but he pushed the discomfort aside. He spotted Isabella across the room, talking to a young woman who looked no older than 20. The girl was holding a sleeping toddler, her face a mix of exhaustion and relief as Isabella handed her a brochure and a packet of diapers. Isabella turned and froze when she saw Jasper standing there. Her expression was unreadable, but her tone was sharp when she approached him. "What are you doing here?" she asked, crossing her arms. "I wanted to see this for myself," Jasper said simply. "I wanted to understand what you do." Isabella raised an eyebrow. "And why the sudden interest? Trying to prove something?" Jasper hesitated, then shook his head. "No, I realized I've been wrong about a lot of things. I came to learn." Her skepticism was evident, but she didn't dismiss him outright. Instead, she handed him a clipboard. "If you're serious, you can start by helping. We're sorting supplies for the food pantry." Jasper took the clipboard without protest and followed her instructions. For the next few hours, he worked alongside the volunteers, organizing boxes of canned goods and packing bags for families in need. It was tedious, repetitive work, but it gave him a new perspective. He listened as the volunteers shared their stories, their struggles, and their hopes for the future. Many of them had been beneficiaries of Rise Up's programs and were now giving back to their community. Isabella kept a watchful eye on Jasper, noting how out of his element he seemed. Yet to her surprise, he didn't complain or try to assert his authority. He worked quietly, listening more than he spoke. By the end of the day, his shirt sleeves were rolled up, his tie was loosened, and his perfectly polished demeanor was gone. He looked, for once, like an ordinary man trying to do something meaningful. That evening, as they closed up the center, Jasper approached Isabella. She was tidying up a table of brochures, her exhaustion evident but her focus unwavering. "Thank you," he said, his voice softer than usual. Isabella looked up, surprised. "For what?" "For letting me see this," Jasper said. "For giving me the chance to understand." Her expression softened, but she didn't let her guard down entirely. "Understanding is one thing, Jasper, but this isn't a one-time thing. These people need consistency, not empty gestures." "I know," he said, his gaze steady. "And I want to help, not just with money, but with my time, my connections, whatever I can do to support what you're building." Isabella studied him carefully, searching for any hint of insincerity. For the first time, she saw something different in him, something genuine. It wasn't enough to erase the past, but it was a start. "We'll see," she said, finally. Actions speak louder than words. Over the next few weeks, Jasper followed through on his promise. He began spending more time at Rise Up, not as a benefactor but as a volunteer. He attended meetings, helped organize events, and even participated in a fundraising campaign. Slowly, he earned the trust of the staff and volunteers, though many remained wary of his intentions. For Isabella, watching Jasper's transformation was both gratifying and confusing. She had expected him to give up after a few days, but he persisted. He was no longer the arrogant billionaire who dismissed her work as insignificant. He was trying, truly trying, to understand a world that had once been invisible to him. One afternoon, as they worked side by side in the food pantry, Jasper spoke up. "You were right," he said quietly, "about everything. I've spent my life chasing things that don't matter, thinking they'd make me happy, but they haven't." Isabella paused, her hand stilling as she placed a can of soup in a bag. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "What changed?" "You did," Jasper admitted. "You showed me a different way of living, a way I never thought about before, and now I can't stop thinking about it." Isabella didn't respond immediately. She had seen glimpses of this side of Jasper before, but now it seemed real, unforced. Yet she couldn't forget the circumstances that had brought them together, or the fact that he still hadn't told her the full truth about the bet. "I'm glad you're starting to see things differently," she said finally. "But change takes time, and trust takes even longer." Jasper nodded, accepting her words. For the first time, he wasn't looking for a quick victory or a shortcut to success. He was willing to wait to prove himself, not just to Isabella, but to the man he wanted to become. As they finished packing the last of the food bags, a quiet understanding passed between them. It wasn't forgiveness, nor was it love, not yet, but it was a step forward, and for Jasper, that was enough. The weeks following Jasper's decision to actively support Rise Up marked the start of an unlikely transformation. What had begun as a superficial effort to prove himself to Isabella was now something deeper. Though Jasper didn't fully understand it yet, he found himself drawn to the work not just for the validation it might bring, but because it felt real in a way his corporate empire never had. Each day at the community center presented new challenges and lessons. Jasper met single mothers juggling jobs and childcare, teenagers desperate for a second chance, and elderly residents struggling to maintain dignity in the face of financial hardship. Their stories were raw, unfiltered, and inescapably human. For the first time in years, Jasper felt the weight of his privilege and the hollowness of the world he had built around himself. The transformation wasn't easy. Jasper's presence at the center was met with skepticism by some and outright hostility by others. Many of the volunteers saw him as an interloper, a billionaire playing at charity for his own gain. It was a sentiment Jasper couldn't entirely refute after all. His initial involvement had been little more than a calculated move in a game he no longer wanted to play. One afternoon during a volunteer meeting, Jasper presented an idea for expanding the center's programs. He suggested leveraging his corporate connections to bring in more funding and resources. The room fell silent, and all eyes turned to Isabella. She stood, her expression unreadable, and addressed the group. "Jasper's connections could help us reach more people," she said carefully. "But we need to make sure we stay true to our mission. This work isn't about impressing donors or chasing big numbers. It's about real change, and that starts with listening to the community." Her words stung, but Jasper nodded in agreement. He understood that his approach needed to change. This wasn't his world, and he couldn't treat it like another business venture. Despite the challenges, Jasper persisted. He began spending hours at the center, helping with everything from organizing events to scrubbing floors. The volunteers, initially wary, began to see a different side of him. He wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty, and he was willing to admit when he didn't have all the answers. Isabella noticed the change too. Jasper was no longer the arrogant, detached man she had married out of obligation. He listened more than he spoke, asked questions instead of issuing orders, and seemed genuinely invested in the work they were doing. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unsaid between them. One evening, after a particularly long day at the center, Jasper and Isabella found themselves alone in the office. The volunteers had gone home, and the building was quiet, except for the hum of the air conditioning. Jasper was reviewing a stack of grant applications, his sleeves rolled up and his tie loosened. Isabella sat across from him, sorting through donation records. "I've been thinking," Jasper said suddenly, breaking the silence, "about how I've lived my life up until now." Isabella looked up, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. "What about it?" "I've spent so much time chasing things that don't matter," he admitted. "Money, power, status. I thought they would make me happy, but they haven't. Not really." Isabella's expression softened, but she didn't respond immediately. She had seen glimpses of this side of Jasper before, but this felt different, more sincere. "What do you want now?" she asked. Jasper hesitated, then looked at her with a clarity that startled even himself. "I want to do something meaningful. I want to be someone who actually makes a difference." Isabella studied him for a long moment, searching for any hint of insincerity. Finally, she nodded. "Then start by showing up every day, no matter how hard it gets. That's the only way to earn trust." Jasper took her words to heart. Over the next few weeks, he became an integral part of the center's operations. He worked tirelessly, not because he wanted recognition, but because he wanted to prove to Isabella, to the volunteers, and to himself that he was capable of change. At the same time, Jasper began making changes in his corporate life. He started questioning the practices of Carter Enterprises, especially those that prioritize profit over people. He pushed for policies that promoted fair wages, ethical sourcing, and community investment. His board of directors resisted, but Jasper was relentless. As Jasper's transformation gained momentum, his friends in high society began to take notice. Hugo Whitman, the man who had proposed the bet in the first place, invited Jasper to lunch to catch up. "I have to admit," Hugo said, as they sat in a private dining room at an exclusive club, "you've surprised me. I didn't think you'd last this long. Jasper frowned. What do you mean? This whole charity act, Hugo said, smirking. It's impressive, but it's not you. You're a businessman, Jasper, not a social worker. Jasper's jaw tightened. People can change, Hugo. Maybe, Hugo said, leaning back in his chair. But don't forget why you started this. A bet is a bet, after all. The reminder hit Jasper like a punch to the gut. He had almost forgotten about the bet, or at least he had wanted to. His relationship with Isabella, once a game, had become something far more complicated, and now the weight of his deception loomed over him like a storm cloud. Back at the penthouse that evening, Jasper sat alone in the living room, nursing a glass of scotch. He thought about Isabella, her strength, her determination, the way she had forced him to confront his own shortcomings. He realized he couldn't keep lying to her. If he truly wanted to change, he needed to come clean. When Isabella walked in, exhausted from another long day, Jasper stood to meet her. Isabella, he began, his voice unsteady. There's something I need to tell you. She looked at him, her expression weary but patient. What is it? Jasper hesitated, the weight of his confession pressing down on him. He had spent his entire life avoiding vulnerability, but now he had no choice. If he wanted to earn Isabella's trust, he had to start by telling her the truth, no matter the consequences. Jasper stood in the dimly lit living room, the city lights streaming through the massive windows behind him. The glass of scotch in his hand trembled slightly as he faced Isabella, who stood across the room, still clutching her bag. Her face was calm but cautious, her eyes narrowing slightly at his obvious unease. I've been dishonest with you, Jasper began, his voice low but steady. About why I approached you, about why I suggested this marriage. Isabella placed her bag on the counter, folding her arms. Her expression remained unreadable, but Jasper could sense the tension in the room thickening. Go on, she said, her tone measured but firm. Jasper drew in a deep breath. When I first proposed this arrangement, it wasn't because I cared about your work, or even because I believed in it. It was part of a bet. The words hung in the air like a guillotine. Isabella's posture stiffened, her arms dropping to her sides as her eyes bore into him. A bet? She repeated, her voice sharp. You married me because of a bet? Jasper nodded, guilt washing over him like a wave. Yes. It started as a challenge, a game really. Hugo Whitman dared me to marry someone who didn't fit my world, to prove that I could adapt to anything and still win. The words tasted bitter now, their hollowness glaring in the face of what he had come to feel. And I was just part of the game, Isabella said, her voice quieter now but no less cutting. A piece on your chessboard? No, Jasper said quickly, stepping closer. Not anymore. I know how it sounds, and I know I was wrong. So wrong. But things changed. You changed me. This started as a bet, but now it's so much more than that. I care about you, Isabella. I care about what you've built, and I care about the people you're fighting for. Isabella held up a hand, silencing him. So when exactly did it stop being a game for you? After the wedding? After you realized you couldn't control me? Or was it after you saw that your money didn't mean anything to me? Jasper's mouth opened, but no words came. He had no answer that wouldn't sound like an excuse. Isabella shook her head, her voice rising. Do you even understand what you've done? You didn't just lie to me. You used me. You took something as personal as marriage, something I only agreed to because I thought it could help the people I care about, and you turned it into a stunt. I know, Jasper said, his voice breaking. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I had to tell you. I couldn't keep lying to you. Isabella stared at him for a long moment, her jaw tight. You think telling me the truth now changes anything? It doesn't erase the fact that you played with my life, that you played with the trust I gave you. Her words were like knives, each one cutting deeper than the last. Jasper felt the weight of his actions in a way he never had before. He had spent his life avoiding responsibility for the harm he caused, hiding behind wealth and power. But now there was no escape. I don't expect you to forgive me, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. But I wanted you to know the truth. You deserve that much. Isabella exhaled sharply, shaking her head. The truth? The truth is that this was never about me. It was always about you, your ego, your need to prove something to yourself or your friends. And now that you've destroyed whatever trust we had, you think you can fix it with an apology? Jasper's heart sank. He had hoped for a different response, though he knew he didn't deserve it. Isabella, please, no, she interrupted, her voice firm. I don't want to hear it. I don't know if I can ever trust you again, Jasper. And without trust, there's nothing left. With that, she turned and walked toward the door, grabbing her bag as she went. Jasper followed her, his chest tight with desperation. Isabella, wait, he called after her. Please, just let me prove to you that I've changed. She stopped at the door and turned to face him, her expression resolute. Change isn't enough, Jasper. Not when it comes at the expense of someone else's dignity. The door closed behind her with a quiet click, leaving Jasper alone in the silence of the penthouse. He stood frozen for a long time, staring at the door as if willing her to come back, but deep down he knew she wouldn't. The days that followed were the loneliest Jasper had ever experienced. Without Isabella, the penthouse felt cavernous and empty, its luxury meaningless. He threw himself into work, but even that provided little solace. The projects that once fueled his ambition now felt shallow and insignificant. At Rise Up, Isabella continued her work with unwavering determination. She refused to let Jasper's betrayal derail her mission. Yet even as she poured herself into the community, the weight of his confession lingered. She couldn't deny that Jasper had changed. His actions over the past few months had been genuine, but the foundation of their relationship had been built on a lie, and that was a wound not easily healed. Meanwhile, Jasper began taking steps to atone for his actions. He donated millions to Rise Up, not as a means to win back Isabella's favor, but because he believed in the work she was doing. He also started reevaluating his business practices, implementing policies that prioritized ethics over profit. These changes earned him both praise and criticism from his peers, but Jasper didn't care. For the first time, he wasn't living for their approval. Still, none of it felt like enough. He couldn't shake the memory of Isabella's face as she walked out the door, the pain in her eyes as she realized the depth of his betrayal. He wanted to make things right, but he didn't know how, or if it was even possible. One evening, as Jasper sat alone in the penthouse, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from one of the volunteers at Rise Up, thanking him for his recent contributions and sharing a photo of the new community center they had been able to open with his funding. The photo showed Isabella standing in front of the building, surrounded by children and volunteers. She looked tired but radiant, her smile wide and genuine. Jasper stared at the image for a long time, a lump forming in his throat. He realized then that his journey wasn't about earning Isabella's forgiveness or winning her back. It was about becoming the kind of man who could look in the mirror and be proud of what he saw. If there was any chance of rebuilding what they had lost, it would have to start with him, not his wealth, not his connections, but the person he was trying to become. And for the first time, Jasper understood that redemption wasn't a destination, it was a path he was finally ready to walk. Months passed, each day marked by quiet determination on both sides. For Jasper, life had become a relentless pursuit of redemption. He no longer sought validation from his wealth or social circle, but from the actions he took to repair the damage he had caused. His once flawless world of power prestige now felt hollow, and the work he did with Rise Up became his anchor, a reminder that change was possible, even for someone like him. Isabella, meanwhile, buried herself in her work. She had expanded Rise Up's programs, opening new community centers and launching initiatives for job training and affordable housing. Jasper's substantial donations had helped, but she made it clear to her team that their mission would never be tied to one person's money. Her resolve was ironclad, but late at night, when the city quieted and the weight of the day settled in, she couldn't stop thinking about Jasper, not the man who had used her for a bet, but the man he was becoming, the one who had shown glimpses of humility, empathy, and even love. One crisp autumn evening, Isabella stood on the steps of Rise Up's newest center, watching as families streamed inside for the grand opening celebration. The building was a testament to years of hard work, a bright spot in a neighborhood that had long been overlooked. She greeted volunteers and guests, her smile genuine but tinged with exhaustion. Amid the crowd, a familiar figure caught her eye. Jasper stood near the entrance, dressed simply in jeans and a sweater, a far cry from the polished suits he once wore like armor. He looked nervous, holding a small envelope in his hands as he scanned the room. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the noise of the crowd seemed to fade. Isabella hesitated before walking over to him, her heart pounding despite herself. "Jasper," she said, her tone cautious but not unkind. "What are you doing here?" He offered a tentative smile. "I heard about the opening. I wanted to see it for myself." She studied him for a moment, noting the subtle changes in his demeanor. He seemed quieter, more grounded, as though the months apart had stripped away the layers of arrogance that once defined him. "It's a big night," she said, gesturing toward the bustling center. "A lot of people came together to make this happen. You should be proud," Jasper said sincerely. "This is incredible, Isabella." Her expression softened, but she kept her guard up. "Thank you, but this isn't about me. It's about them, the community." "I know," Jasper said. He held out the envelope. "I wanted to give you this. It's a personal donation, separate from what the company has done. No strings attached." Isabella took the envelope but didn't open it. Instead, she looked up at him, her voice measured. "You didn't have to come here for this." "I didn't come just for that," Jasper admitted. "I came because I wanted to see you." Isabella's heart tightened, but she didn't let it show. "Why?" Jasper ran a hand through his hair, a rare moment of vulnerability breaking through. "Because I needed to tell you that I'm sorry again. Not just for the bet, but for everything. For the way I dismissed you. For the way I tried to control everything. For not seeing you for who you are from the start." Isabella didn't respond immediately. She held his gaze, searching for any sign of pretense but found none. For the first time, his words felt unguarded, free of the calculated charm he had once relied on. "I don't know if I can trust you, Jasper," she said finally, her voice quiet. "Not yet." "I understand," he said, his tone steady. "I don't expect you to forget overnight. But I'm not here to win anything. I just wanted you to know that I see you now truly, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that." The evening continued, but Jasper stayed on the periphery, watching as Isabella moved through the crowd with grace and purpose. He didn't push her to talk further, respecting her need for space. When the event wound down, he slipped out quietly, leaving her with the envelope and the words he hoped had conveyed his sincerity. At home that night, Isabella opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, handwritten in Jasper's precise, elegant script. It wasn't long, but it carried the weight of everything he couldn't say aloud. "Isabella, I've spent my life building walls, thinking they made me strong. But you showed me that strength comes from letting those walls down. You challenged me in ways no one else ever has, and for that, I will always be grateful. I don't know if I'll ever deserve your forgiveness, but I will keep trying because you and the work you do have changed me in ways I never thought possible. Yours." Jasper. Isabella read the letter twice, her emotions a tangled mix of anger, sadness, and something she couldn't quite name. She wasn't ready to forgive him, not completely. But for the first time, she wondered if there might be a path forward. Over the following weeks, Jasper continued to support Rise Up from a distance, respecting Isabella's boundaries while remaining steadfast in his commitment to the work. Slowly, she began to see the depth of his transformation not in grand gestures, but in the quiet consistency of his actions. One afternoon, as they worked side by side at a food drive, Isabella broke the silence. "You've changed, Jasper." He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "I had to." "I see that," she said, her tone softening. "But change isn't enough on its own. It has to last." "It will," Jasper said. "Because this isn't just about you, Isabella. It's about being the kind of man I can live with. And for the first time, I feel like I'm getting there." Isabella nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "We'll see." Months later, they stood together at another Rise Up event, this time as partners not in business, not in obligation, but in something new and unspoken. Their journey had been messy, painful, and uncertain, but it had brought them to a place of mutual respect and understanding. As the sun set over the city, Jasper turned to Isabella. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" she asked. "For giving me a chance to change," he said. "For showing me that it's never too late to start over." Isabella smiled, the warmth in her eyes finally reaching him. "Just don't waste it, Jasper." "I won't," he promised. And for the first time, they stood not as adversaries or strangers, but as equals ready to face whatever came next, together. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss our latest videos. Share this video with your friends and family, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Check out our other stories for more captivating content. See you in the next one.